I glare outside my door, stretched out and purring, waiting for more. Strange shade of stone, deep cat eye green, no way to escape, no one hears my scream. He's a jag, he's a jag, he's a jag, you are. He's a jag, he's a jag, he's a jag, you are.
Hi, I'm Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and I'm here with Carmen Balta. And we are in Cairo, Egypt, at the base, practically, of all three pyramids and the Sphinx, and this is the plateau. What do you call this? The Sphinx Guest House. That's the location, right?
Yep.
And I'm very happy to be here. We've just been on a marvelous trip all through Egypt, and Carmen has been leading us and informing us as to some of the true history of Egypt. And so I'm here to ask her a few questions and to really reveal some of the things you told us on the trip as much as possible for the Camelot audience. So Carmen has recently made a video called The Pyramid Code. You were filmed as well as, I imagine, you produced and directed it.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yep. It's five TV episodes, 5 hours, and it's been shown in 24 countries, and now it's out on DVD.
Okay, wonderful. And we encourage anyone watching this to go out and get The Pyramid Code from her website. It will be linked from this page as well. So, Carmen, what I'd like to ask you, first of all, is why you called it the Pyramid Code.
Well, I think that there's so much information about the pyramids, and a lot of it is encoded, and there's secrets that still haven't been uncovered, and a lot of misinformation about the pyramids. And so I think that there's a way of looking at it so that we can reveal some of the lost secrets.
Okay, but in terms of code, is that just a generalization for the secrets, or is there a specific code that you've uncovered?
Well, I think that the Band of Peace, which is the expanse of 6 pyramid sites from Abu Raush to the north of here, all the way to Dashur, 15 miles to the south, are an encodement of a sky-ground correlation that's much more extensive than Robert Bauval indicates when he says that the 3 pyramids of Giza are associated with the belt of Orion. That seems to be true, and there seems to be a lot more to it than that. But also, in terms of the Hall of Records, a lot of people think that you're going to find an English book underneath the left paw of the Sphinx, and that it's going to reveal the secrets. But I think that the encoding has to do with an understanding of the ancient knowledge of initiations and the high-level initiates and the knowledge that they had. And so that's also a code.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. It could even be encoded in a sort of hologram, isn't that right?
Yes, a hologram, but also hidden in plain sight. So there's many frescoes that are indicating things, and some people think it's stylized. And when you see 2 left hands, and that the Egyptians didn't really know, how to do the hands properly, without realizing that that in itself is also a symbol that has a source to it that's very deep for the Egyptians. So there's a few symbols that have been overlooked, and that haven't been deciphered, that really are keys to a whole world of ancient Egypt.
So can you talk about some of that? And I'm also curious, just to backtrack a tiny bit, which is where you're talking about the peace, a peace configuration. Why do you say peace in terms of the placement of the 6 sites?
Band of Peace. At Abu Ghraib, Hakim is an indigenous wisdom keeper, and he is featured in the Pyramid Code, and he left us 2 years ago, August. And he talks about how it was peace and food, that the peace along the plateau and the pyramid sites, the 6 sites, actually the peacefulness of the way the high-level initiates existed here and the work they did was actually food for the people. Peace was food. So the Band of Peace is indicating that it wasn't what we have now. patriarchal ways of being and thinking that are warring, and one person fighting against the other and competitive and that sort of thing. The ancient Egyptians in pre-dynastic Egypt actually were matriarchal. And so there's a lot more to it than traditional Egyptology has been telling us.
Right, and that's something that you
is right out the window, and my first thought was, how close can you get to it? And then I startled again and thought, well, why do I care? Like, why is that interesting? So I was still very young, and I went to my mother and I said, where's Egypt? And she said, I don't know. look it up in the atlas. So I looked it up and I went, oh, it's on the African continent. And, you know, how do you get there? She says, I don't know, phone the airlines. And so at the age of 12, I found out that tickets were $1,400 at that age, and even in that day and age, and I was making 25 cents an hour babysitting, and I pledged that I would come to Egypt. So I came for the first time in 1977, and there's been a lot of changes since then, and I read everything I could get my hands on, and yet there was something that went on when I read that turned my stomach, that made me think that there was something wrong with the story. And so I came back in '94, and so there was a big gap in between from '77 to '94, and during that time I did an awful lot of research. But since then, I've come back 24 times.
Incredible, 24 times. And you've been interviewed on Coast to Coast, and you, I assume you've written some books?
Yes. That
I haven't read, I'm sorry, because I actually just learned about you when I interviewed you sort of off the cuff for Pig Radio is what it's called.
Yeah.
I was invited to be a co-host just for your interview, which was, you know, very unusual, sort of a serendipity, because it's what got me on this trip.
Yeah, with Jeremiah Duncan.
Yes.
Yeah. My book is called Angels and Archetypes, an Evolutionary Map of Feminine Consciousness. And in that book there's 22 goddesses, and their higher selves are angels, and it's a map that mirrors astrology, numerology, and tarot, and it's the lost secrets of the sacred feminine. And 4 of the goddesses are Egyptian goddesses, and 7 of them are Greek goddesses, and the rest of them are from around the world.
Fascinating. What are the 4?
The goddesses are Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty, Isis, Nui, some people call her Nut, but I don't think that's fair, and so she's the cosmic goddess, and Ma'at. Ma'at, who carries the feather of truth. And there's a story behind each one of them, for sure, deep stories behind each one of them.
Okay, and it would be worthwhile for you to say something about each one if you are interested in doing so.
Sure. Ma'at, she has the feather of truth in her headdress, and it was a very instructive story to the general populace, because the idea is that when you died, you were met by the jackal-headed god Anubis, who says, you're dead. And you go, I am? I feel exactly the same. And they say, check it out, your body's down there. And then they say, let's have your heart. And they would take your heart and weigh it on the scales against the feather of truth. So if you had done something immoral, stolen or done something that was against humanity in some way, your heart would be heavy. And the gods that met you would say, we don't want you over here. You can't cross into the Bardos unless you are light of heart. And so that was a way that the populace could live well and learn to live well. But later, in the later dynasties, when the Amun priesthood took over, you could buy your salvation, and you could buy these little Shakti dolls, and then Horus would hold up the scale and say, yep, you're good to go. And so that was a real distortion from the true spirituality that went to religion. And then if we go on to Nui, the milk from her breasts is the milk of the Milky Way. And so there's a sky-ground correlation between all of the pyramids, as I mentioned, from Abu Rosh through Giza, and then Abu Sir, and Saqqara, and Dashur. And all of those are a sky-ground correlation that parallel the Nile where it used to run. And so you can see the old riverbed, but now the Nile is 8 miles to the east. But it's significant that that configuration follows the configuration of the stars and the planets in the sky. And so how the ancients could have understood this is beyond most people's capacity to understand. So if you think that Sirius would have been Abu Rosh, and you can go into Starry Night Pro and put in the planets Sirius, Orion, and the Pleiades, and what you'll see is that the belt of Orion, the sword of Orion is pointing to the Pleiades, and Sirius is behind, always, and you'll see on the ceiling of the Temple of Dendera that Isis always has her hand around the belt of Orion. She stands behind him on the solar boat, and Orion's sword points to the Pleiades. Now what's significant here, they say Sirius is a dog star in the Dogon tradition, and a dog generally on the leash follows behind. Yeah, and the sword pointing to the Pleiades. But the most significant thing is that the alignment never separates. So in Starry Night, you can roll things back 50,000 years, and you can roll things forward. Hits solstice, and the very next day there's 1 more minute of light, 2 more minutes of light, and 3 days later we're starting to feel pretty good, even though we have the same amount of light as we did 6 days ago when we were 3 days before solstice. But the emergence of light starts to make us feel better, and this is where we're heading in humanity, humanity is heading now as we approach 2012. And so if you think of the top of a cup of water, we have been approaching this galactic alignment since 2008. If you think astrologically, a conjunction is within 6 degrees. 2008 we hit the edge, solstice. 2009 10, 11, 12. And so what's been happening is we've been approaching the energy and spinning out of it, and approaching the energy and spinning out of it. But every time we approach, we're getting closer to the bullseye. But I think that's why we've had the tsunamis and earthquakes and all the earth changes, is because we really are in this now. And so when people say that when we approach 2012 Armageddon's going to hit, they're actually using images from tsunamis that have already happened, from earthquakes that have already happened. And so I think this doomsday, and it's all going to hit us at solstice 2012 is actually a little bit of an exaggeration. It could be that we actually finish or are close to finishing with it then. And the other thing that's significant is the whole alignment is sunset Giza, and we're watching the sunset as we sit here, 2012. And so December 21st, 2012. So some people have said it's 11:11 in the morning and it's configured at Greenwich Mean Time. No. If you look in Starry Night Pro, it's sunset, the Great Pyramid, December 21st, 2012.
Okay, well, that's fascinating. Are you planning to be here then?
Yes, and we were here for 10-10-10 in the Great Pyramid, which is considered an ascension portal. 11-11-11 is another one, so November 11th, and then 12-12-12. And if a group is here, we would be in the Great Pyramid for December 12th, but at sunset on the 21st, I would hope to join with other groups and be on the plateau at sunset to feel the exact precision of that galactic alignment.
Okay,
So
that's an interesting date to plan to be here. So let's hope that the world situation will hold steady to allow for that.
Yes, well, we do need to hold it steady. So moving on with the other goddesses, Hathor would be another goddess, and she is the only human personification that you see on any of the temple pillars in Egypt. What you see is capitals, the tops of pillars, that are either papyrus or lotus, and they represent the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, and you'll see that at the Holy of Holies at Karnak, one of each, indicating that the balance between the masculine and the feminine has to be reached before the initiate could go into the Holy of Holies. And so Hathor has her own face, but what you see, and many people are curious about why you see Egyptian frescoes in two dimensions. You always see the profile of people, but with Hathor you see her face full. And the metaphor is that the profile of the two-dimensional being is actually in the third dimension, and Hathor being shown in three dimensions is actually a fourth dimensional and beyond being. So Tom Kenyon talks about the Hathors as a race of beings, and Hathor would be one manifestation of the Great Mother Goddess, who represents love and beauty and dance and all things that are joyful, and music and that sort of thing. So she is the Great Cosmic Mother. Yes, and so she's highly significant, totally beautiful, has her own temple at Dendera, and then there is a shrine to Hathor at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae. And so Isis is the last of the four goddesses, and she represents the Sirius, the planet Sirius, as Osiris represents the configuration of Orion. And so whether these archetypal energies necessarily were incarnate or symbolic, how gods and goddesses were represented, it doesn't necessarily matter to the human psyche whether they're incarnate or not. It is the energy of the archetype that actually speaks to us. And it exists, the definition of an archetype is that it exists and it has power whether we're conscious of it or not. And so Isis is another manifestation of the Great Mother, and she is the mother of Horus, and every pharaoh emulated being a Horus. And so Isis, the story is that Osiris was confronted by his evil brother Set, and he chopped his body up into 14 pieces and scattered it all over Egypt, and Isis was crying and trying to put him back together, and they put everything back together except they couldn't find his phallus. And at the temple of Dendera, where you see the 39,000-year-old zodiac. In the chamber right beside it, you see how there was some kind of magic that occurred that allowed a personification of Horus to lower himself down onto the dead body of Osiris and get impregnated so that Isis could give birth to the personification of all the pharaohs. But that's also replicated in Jesus and Mary, Isis and the child Horus. So we see many replications of what went on in Egypt that have carried over into modern religions such as Catholicism. And then there were temples of Isis all the way around the Mediterranean basin. There was a huge network of temples of Isis, and the populace really benefited from this. Sometimes she was even depicted as a black Madonna, and so this lent itself to the populace being fed and nourished by the idea of the gods and goddesses, by the idea of the story of Isis and Osiris and Horus. And so the goddess Isis continued in her importance for many millennia.
So also Isis continues to this day, doesn't she, influencing Egypt and being an important goddess at this time?
Absolutely. And so when you look in the temples, you will see the manifestation of these four goddesses, and they're everywhere, and they are telling the archetypal story to the populace, and they are giving the encodements of how to live well and how to balance the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine. But these are four goddesses.
Okay. First, do you think that the establishment in Egypt in the early days came from Atlantis?
There is speculation of this, and there's only one subject that has more books written about it than Egypt, and that's Atlantis. And so Atlantis gets the all-time record for the most number of books ever written about it. And so I think it appeals again to our unconscious. There's a place inside us that really wants to know what our origins are and where we came from. And people can say there's no hard proof of Atlantis, and yet all over the world there's things that have been found underwater in the Bermuda Triangle, and then we've got, you know, Plato's story about it. And it actually fits that there could have been a high-level civilization in the Golden Age that was threatened through earth changes, that was the secrets were going to be lost, and it could very well be that various evacuation committees were put together, and that Egypt is one of the sites that the knowledge came to. We can't prove it.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, do you have any past life recall? Because you apparently seem to have past life recall of any time in regard to Atlantis.
Absolutely. By the time I was 35, I had recall of 85 past lives, and I stopped counting then. And for sure, Atlantis was one of them. And it does make sense, and it fits together how star knowledge and sophisticated level and high-level technology and all of that was in Atlantis. And yes, I feel I do remember.
Okay. Let's see, Abu Ghraib, is that how you say it, Abu Ghraib? The configuration there, that very strange, I was told it was a spaceport by William Henry and Jordan Maxwell at the time. I don't know if you relate to it in that way. But that was, in essence, they felt Atlantean. Do you feel that way?
Well, I think you can't isolate the entire area. I think the whole of the Band of Peace is a unified field. And to isolate one bit or another it doesn't make sense and is not necessary. One of the things that is striking about Abu Ghraib, and perhaps we should pause for a moment and say that it's highly significant that the name Abu Ghraib is also the name of the jail and the torture chamber. And I think that's no accident. Like, there's some really interesting parallels that run through these things, and it's as though the powers that be had an understanding of the sacredness of that place. And so there's a lot that goes with the site of Abu Ghraib. And I'd like to tell you a little story. Since I've spent 7 hours doing interviews on Coast to Coast, and I've gotten thousands and thousands of letters from people. And one of them was from a woman who contacted me, and she said that she had this vision, and she wasn't particularly interested in channeling or any of those sorts of things. And she had this guide that came to her, and he kept telling her these stories, and she's like, well, who are you? And he says, well, I'm your guide. And she says, well, why are you here? And he said, well, perhaps I can help you. And she says, help me what? And so she was really quite the skeptic. And so he was trying to warm up to her, and so she said, tell me something I can't know. And so he said, okay, I'm going to tell you a story about this place called Abu Ghraib. And so she had visions of the crystal altar and all these different things. And so she goes online and she types in Abu Ghraib, and she gets all these miles and miles and miles of pictures of torture chambers. And it was a full 5 years later that I came on the radio and started talking about it, and I started talking about the crystal altar and the crystal bowls that looked like satellite dishes that were there. And she said, please call me. And for all the thousands of letters that I got from people, I never picked up the phone and felt compelled to phone somebody who gave me their phone number. And then she had all these different details of this, and that's what her spirit guide had given her. But it really struck me that the torture that she went through, by the name being cross-referenced with a torture chamber, and she had to wait 5 years before the clarification came about this incredibly sacred place. And I thought that that's one of the ways that the powers that be can cross-wire us and confuse the issue between something that is the ultimate sacred thing and something that is the ultimate evil, if you will.
Fascinating.
It is. So now that we've talked about the name, let's talk about what's there. First of all, the base is not a pyramid. It's actually the base of an obelisk. And it was the biggest obelisk that was ever known in Egypt, and then they lost it. How can you lose an obelisk? So Hakim used to say that perhaps it was in Italy, and so it probably is the one that's at Lake Como, somewhere in there, and it had a gold capstone on it. But it was Ibra, which is the eye of the needle where the sun comes in. And so there's also speculation that instead of the pyramid being a planet, all the pyramids are planetary systems and stars, what was this obelisk pointing to? Because there's no relationship of the other things like Abu Sir and Giza, Abu Raush, Saqqara, and Dashur. So Abu Ghraib stands on its own. It's a separate site, and what's in front of it is this enormous quartz crystal laser cut altar with a 6-foot circle in the middle, and Hakim says that's a lid on a shaft to a tunnel system that's 180 feet deep. Now, it's absolutely certain that there is a network of passageways that goes underneath the Giza Plateau and underneath all of these sites from one end to the other. And Hakim talks about, as a child, being able to walk, crawl, swim in these passageways. But one of the things that contributed to my field work was being able to get on the plateau at sunset every night. And so I spent the better part of 5 years living here in and out of Cairo, but going on the plateau every night and going and finding entrances to these passageways, and all of them are blocked. But there are shafts that go all the way into this honeycomb of passageways that is connected to a big grid system. And apparently that stone circle that's cut out of quartz crystal is a lid to one of these shafts. It also has these huge slabs that point in the 4 cardinal directions, and we actually did a ritual there a few days ago. There are quartz crystals, for lack of a better way, basins that are probably 2.5 feet across, that the traditional Egyptologists say were for sacrificing of bulls. Well, how are you going to fit a bull in a basin that's 2.5 feet deep, A, and if it's white quartz crystal, it would be blood-stained, and there is a hole that is so precisely cut in each of these, and when we were there, and the hole is laser cut, obviously, but there's little lumps that almost look like gears, cogs on a wheel. But what I noticed this time was that there was actually little impressions, and Lead Scallion, who did the Coral Castle in Florida, he said that he held the secrets of the ancient Egyptians, and he was able to do anti-gravity and create this huge site with large stones, and he actually even moved it. He did all the work alone, and he had to have been doing anti-gravity because these stones that he was moving were several tons, tens of tons.
Yes.
Yes, and on YouTube right now there is a description of the physics of the speculation of what he might have done, And you see these circles that are divided up into divisions, and he put a magnet in between each of these little divisions. And so I hadn't noticed until 2 days ago that there's actually a little depression, and you could easily put something in these little depressions. And so it's almost certain that in conjunction with the schist disk, which is another artifact that I can talk about in a moment, that this would have had to do with anti-gravity and a high level of sophisticated technology. So this fits with the quartz crystal floor, which there's pieces of that are in front of the second pyramid. There's always a temple to the east of each pyramid. To the east of the step pyramid, there's a huge courtyard at Saqqara, and there would have been a quartz crystal floor that would have been 12 to 15 inches deep, open to the air, and polished. And so we have teeny tiny little crystals in an ADSL cable, in a CD, in a watch. Pretty much everything we have that's electronic works on these teeny tiny little crystals. And when you think about the expanse and the hugeness of the crystals that they were working with, you really have to start to wonder what the Egyptians were up to. Now the schist disk was made out of a thin green stone. It's got a hole in the middle, and it looks like a propeller with flat pieces, but if you were to turn the thing, it would almost look like a helicopter propeller. And they say it's a vase for a lotus flower. Well, where do you put the flower if there's a hole in the middle? And why would you have a porous stone vase? But anyway, they don't know what it is. But it was actually found in a tomb at Saqqara, and but in this tomb, it was obviously a pre-dynastic tomb, and the grave had a skeleton in the fetal position, not a mummy. And it had little bits of pottery, old bits of not string, rope, and this disc that obviously didn't look like it fit with the rest of the grave goods. So the story on that would seem to be that the person who the grave belonged to would have found the schist disc somewhere, would have seen it as an anomaly and something special, would have kept it as a sacred treasure, and was buried with it. But I think that it's really misunderstood how that fits. Now, Hakim said, and we've also found evidence of tubes of stone that are hollow in the middle that were the same shape and size as the schist disc, and there's also these reflective devices that are almost like shields that come down, and so they would have reflected. And when we think about sound and light technology and the use of water, zigzag patterns in the honeycomb, all of this fits together, and it would have vibrated at the sound of the hertz of the earth at the time, and so all of this in combination. And we haven't described all the bits and pieces, but it would have contributed to high-level technology that existed in coordination with many other pieces of high-level initiates working in conjunction with this equipment.
Absolutely, and some of that is mirroring the work of Michael Tellinger down in South Africa, as he's starting to find that sound is a real part of the stone circles down there, and that it could be responsible for generating an electromagnetic field such that resonates within the stones and could have been used to do certain things.
Yes, I did go down to South Africa on the invitation of Michael Tellinger, and I was shooting a trailer for a possible new documentary, and there are prolific stone circles. They do ring like bells. It's very curious indeed. And they are extremely numerous. They are rounded, which reminded me of Malta and various places where there were loosely packed stone circles, which is a completely different construction than Giza.
Yes.
But the roundedness lends itself to some kind of matriarchal, we don't know, and it's impossible to say. The stone circles now would have had to have been reconstructed. You can see underground from the air that parts of them would have been buried and then dug up again and reconstructed. They would be very old indeed, but you can't really perceive what they are from the ground walking around, but if you're in the air, and we did do 3 helicopter flights when I was there, it's almost like the Nazca lines where they don't make sense unless you see them from quite high up.
Yeah,
so it's very inconclusive what they are. There's still a lot of science that needs to be done on them, but definitely a curiosity.
But there is the element also of quartz, silica in the case of those stone circles, which is also part of the Great Pyramid, and the granite that is part of the construction of the pyramids and other temples. So you've always got that element of quartz crystal.
Yes, silica is comparable to quartz. For sure, in Giza and the Band of Peace, there are certain kinds of stone that are used in different ways. So you've got the white Tura limestone, which would have been the casing stones on the Great Pyramid, which would have been white, and on the bent pyramid at Dashur, which also would have been white, and they're almost like an insulated wire. And then in the underground passageways, you've got granite, which emits radon gas, which has a quartz crystal component, and you can see that shining in granite countertops. Yes. And it builds a charge, and it carries a charge. And water moving in zigzag patterns would have carried a charge. And then you've got sandstone, and you've got basalt, and there's various types of stone that in different combinations would have had a different purpose to build a charge and then to release the charge. So as the charge would build in the water, then it would move up the ascending passageways in the Great Pyramid, and what was happening is the hydrogen and the oxygen water molecules would be able to blow apart, and then they could harness the hydrogen and create a passive form of power. And so all of this was known to Nikola Tesla, and his Tesla Tower had very similar features to the construction of the Giza Plateau, including being built on a limestone aquifer. And so it's on Long Island, and it has descending passageways at the same angle as the Giza Plateau, and then the tower itself is replicated in the shape of the pyramid, and the limestone aquifer, it would have percolated water, and so if the river was back where it originated, which would be in front of the foot of the Sphinx, and along where the fertile band still is along the Band of Peace, the river would have filled up these passageways and continued to erode the limestone over time, and then man-made honeycomb passageways, which are pentagons, five-sided.
Pentagon.
Yeah, pentagon. Yeah, okay, and so that would have also been part of the construction, because the angle of the zigzag pattern would have built the charge. And so it's also been said that Tesla knew the secrets of the ancient Egyptians. Leet Scallion knew that. And so there's a percolation through of people who actually remember how this worked. Hakim's one of them, but he also understood this through the indigenous wisdom teachings and through the old Suf language. So when you think of Sufi dancing and whirling dervishes and the linguistic roots of the words, then you can start to piece certain things back together. And one of the things that Hakim was always certain of was that the priests and the priestesses were the ones who worked with water. And the symbol for life is a symbol for fresh water, which is the Ankh. And life comes from fresh water, which is the sacred feminine, in balance with the sacred masculine, because you don't have anything unless you have the balance between the two. And so all of these are little clues that fit together.
I would like you to talk a little bit more about the Great Pyramid and the notion that it is an ascension chamber, and what that means.
Okay. For sure, over millennia, the Great Pyramid would have been used in many different ways. And so there are many, many theories about how the Great Pyramid would have been used. But let's think about how it was found. So when the Great Pyramid was initially found, it was sealed completely, apparently from the inside. And now when you go in the Great Pyramid, there are slats that you can walk up. There are railings that you can hold, but imagine the pyramid without those. I mean, how would you be moving around in there? And so I don't think it was really ever meant for people to be walking around inside. The other thing is that the stone coffer, which is inside the so-called king's chamber, would almost certainly have to have been built within it rather than moved into it. And some people say that that so-called sarcophagus would have been moved, but again, it's built right into the floor. Now, there's another significant feature. The walls are about 4 inches thick, solid granite, and there is a huge hole, a broken bit off the side. Now, if you were to go in there with a sledgehammer in earnest and tried to break a corner off the thing, I don't think you'd be able to. With a strong-armed circus man and the biggest sledgehammer you ever found. But directly opposite where the corner of the Great Pyramid, the sarcophagus is, there's a huge hole in the wall that they've now burrowed a fan into. But you can see that somehow there would have been some kind of an explosion. And then you can see inside the Pyramid of Dashur, there are the red pyramid at Dashur, there are weird chemical marks, and in the passageways there are these enormous, enormous stones that could be 100 tons or more, that have a crack going all the way through, up and around, and you can see this. And so there would have been some kind of an energetic charge inside the pyramid, more than one pyramid, that it would have been some kind of energy device. Now, they tried to blast into the Great Pyramid, and if they had been able to take the pyramids down, they would have, because they're considered un-Islamic, which is similar to blowing up the Buddha statues in Afghanistan. Even though there was protest around the world, they were considered un-Islamic. And so the Giza pyramids, and from one end of the plateau to the other in the Band of Peace, was an open quarry. That there was no respect for the pyramids, and so anybody could come and build whatever they wanted.
So, but when are you talking?
This would have been in 700 AD. 1111, Saladin came along, and so that's when they would have just, taken the stones off.
Wasn't it the Christians that did all the damage?
The Christians did a lot of damage, but they did that around, I don't know, 200, 300 AD. Okay, so they started doing damage. But archaeology was only started in 1910. And so in the 1800s, there were people who had money for expeditions, but they weren't really scientists that were coming. Napoleon came along, and he brought scientists with him in the 1700s, did target practice on the nose of the Sphinx and various things. He brought people who were able to record and measure things. But the pyramid hadn't been penetrated, and they actually used explosives trying to get in. They couldn't figure out how to get into it. Okay, so they took off the casing stones, they blew it up, and there are places where you can see that there actually was an explosive, but you still can't knock the pyramid down, even with these explosives. But they still couldn't get inside. And then a stone dropped, and they could hear that there was an echo, and then thunk, it landed very much how they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, where they heard that there's something was there was a space. Mm-hmm. And so that's where they did the forced entry. And to this day, when you go up the stairs to get into the Great Pyramid, you've been in, it's a very irregular passage that literally was cut by hand, and then it opens up into the Grand Gallery.
Right.
The Queen's Chamber is directly in front. The pit, or the subterranean chamber, goes off to the side, and then you keep going up the Grand Gallery, and the Davidson chambers are accessible there, through another passageway, which they say is the dating calendrical part of the Great Pyramid, into the so-called King's Chamber. When they finally got in there, what they found inside the Queen's Chamber was a kind of chemical residue, and inside the so-called King's Chamber, white powder, like monoatomic gold, as the late Lawrence Gardner would talk about. So what were they doing in there? And how did those chemical compounds end up in there? And why monoatomic gold? Because monoatomic gold changes its properties, densification properties and gravitational properties. And so there was some kind of ceremonial work that was done in there. Somehow the pyramid was sealed from the inside. Now, since people have felt the energy, they've put the slats in and the railings, and people have gone in and they've felt different energies in there. And this time we actually did an experiment with the 37 people, measuring the photonic emissions from the people outside in a neutral field, and then within the Great Pyramid, we measured the radiation fields inside, and I don't mean nuclear radiation, but I mean subtle forms like would come off the granite and the radon gas, and then we measured people outside in the same situation as it was in the pretest, looking for a scientific way of explaining the effect that the Great Pyramid has on the human aura, on the human energy field, and whether or not it actually lasts. And so the pretest and the post-test, the post-test was the day after we had been in the Great Pyramid, and is it possible that the energy fields in there actually are doing something to the human body? So we're coming back to the idea that it's a multi-purpose chamber We're never going to know conclusively how it was used, but the word ascension means that we're moving from one state of densification to a state of more refinement. This, almost certainly, the Egyptians understood this. And they were all about, there were two different focuses that they had, which was the biological imperative of how did we get here? Where did we come from, and what are we doing here? And what happens when we leave? So the entry point into this experience on Earth, and the exit point of then what? And so when you narrow it down, the ancient Egyptians, you know, they really weren't as complicated as we end up thinking they were. We think they were misguided, and they were childlike, and they, you know, worshipped animals and all these sorts of things because of the lack of understanding we have of these simple, different symbols that that were actually manifest. So in terms of the Great Pyramid, it actually carries a charge, even though the casing stones are off it, and the wire, the insulated wire, actually leaks, and so it can't hold the charge like it used to. But the Great Pyramid could have been a closed system that worked with the passage of the Nile, the flooding of the Nile, and then retreated as the water and receded. And it was on a telluric grid system, like dragon lines, like ley lines, that was worldwide, which could have been connected to evacuation plans from Atlantis. Graham Hancock has given us, if you look at the Earth, and like an orange, and every 72 degrees, if you ignore north and south, there is a megalithic stone structure at every point of these 72 degrees. So we have Easter Island, we have Stonehenge, we have Giza, we have many different places. And so it would have been very clever indeed if this closed system was able to generate energy that was actually able to feed the entirety of the Earth through these telluric currents that had an ability to conduct a passive form of magnetic energy that would have sustained a certain amount of energetics on the planet, and now it's broken. And it's still, if you're standing within the structure at the core of itself, it's still generating a field. People know it, and they've experienced it. It's a life-changing thing. It's an imprint that you don't forget. How they were using it would depend on the time frame, and...
Okay, but, you know, and it's funny because we are right here, and I'm going to point the camera in this direction so people can see, but right now we're trying to get the right quality of light on this conversation. The Great Pyramid's right there, so we're discussing it as we look at it. And I have to say that there must have been, though, even though they tried to get in at a later date, it seems to me that there would have been a passage inside where initiates were able to go in and out of the pyramid, that somehow it was sealed after a certain point in history.
Well, again, we get a little cross-referenced, and I think that the real initiation chamber, where the high-level initiates went from the 8th level of initiation to be supercharged to the 9th level, was actually under the second pyramid, which is also right here. And from the Sphinx Temple, I had a lot of memories of that temple, and I looked for it for 10 years, and I was playing that you're warm, you're cold, you're getting warmer, getting colder, and I couldn't find exactly where it was, because it's one of the most highly restricted spots anywhere on the planet. And so when I finally found it and my foot touched the actual stones, it started to run like a movie, and I could see the priestess dresses and smell the flowers and see the candles, and I went, oh, around this stone wall there's a door. And that door is a passageway, a narrow passageway that goes all the way under to the initiation chamber under the second pyramid. And I went around the corner, and there was a metal plate that size right under. And it was a narrow passageway that wouldn't allow you to stand up. But when you think about magic carpet rides, the little silk carpets, there was a way that they could levitate, they could fold their energy to stop, they could lift their energy to float along these passageways, and that was part of a ritual of an initiation. So not the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid possibly was sealed, and it was a machine doing its own thing, but it's a whole different thing in the second pyramid, which could have been an initiation chamber. And Hakim was the first to tell you that the second pyramid was seen as the Great Pyramid. and then and in some places it looks more dominant and it looks higher, depending on the angle that you're looking at it.
That is true, and they've closed. I don't know. I believe that they've closed the Queen's, what they call the Queen's Pyramid. They've closed it.
Well, my understanding of the Queen's Pyramids are the 3 auxiliary pyramids to the south of the 3rd pyramid and right here to the east of the Great Pyramid. The 2nd pyramid is not, I don't know of anybody who calls it the Queen's Pyramids. The Queen's Pyramids are these 3 ones over here.
I've always thought of it.
But they've closed, okay. Over the last decades, they've always had at least one pyramid closed. And it's the intention of the Department of Antiquities to close all the pyramids to the public forevermore.
Right.
And so the fact that we were able to get in there and do a private meditation on October 10th, 2010 here was actually quite fortuitous. So we can't take for granted that these pyramids are going to stay open to the public.
Right, but my question is actually in the 2nd pyramid, I assume you've been inside.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, and it was open for a time, but it's closed now, isn't it?
All I'm saying is that they always open and close things.
Okay.
So over these 25 trips, there's been a different pyramid open and closed for restoration at various times. But I've been in there several. When it's open, I go in. It's been open several times.
Yes. Okay, but it's just an interesting, you know, because this is Project Camelot. We're always looking for conspiracies and reasons behind things, you know, as to why they do what they do. And there's certainly a plot going on here in Egypt in terms of what's being rolled out, in my opinion, after this is my 3rd time here, and after comparing all the evidence and the fact that they do close them, and they close them at odd times and make sure that they're not all 3 open simultaneously, there might be a key there. That's all. You know, it's an interesting dynamic.
You bet.
We're going to give this a shot. Hopefully the sound will maintain itself. Where we were was talking about, and we've got the prayer, the sound of the prayer. Prayers going on in the background, so that's all very interesting. And they're only getting louder. Okay, but I think that they should mellow out pretty soon. I mean, it's great atmosphere, in my opinion. Quite loud.
It's also Friday, so the prayers go on longer.
I see.
Because Friday's their holy day.
And now what is this?
It's
another one.
They start everywhere at the same time, roughly within seconds, based on sunset.
Okay. So we've got sunset. I mean, sunset actually happened a few minutes ago. They're a bit
But
late.
it's 5 times a day.
Yes.
And so they divide the day up based on when sunrise and sunset are.
Okay.
And there's no place in Egypt that you don't hear the prayers unless you're in a resort that's built for foreigners. So the idea is that you will always be able to hear the prayers, and you'll always know the direction to put out the prayer mat.
Well, I have to say that this megaphone is new, at least in the past 4.5 years.
I remember it.
You do?
I do, because this used to be where I'd stay sometimes.
I see, okay.
Yeah, it's tied right to the building that's across from the Sphinx.
But I've noticed that, actually. They seem to have used the new technology to their advantage to get even louder.
Yeah, we're really getting drowned out.
Yeah. Well,
as will be indoors as well.
Well, yeah, we're not going to move. It's just I can stop the camera and wait until it stops. I thought they're answering each other. Sounds like a relay. Okay, so let's continue. So we're talking about the Great Pyramid and the Middle Pyramid, and we're talking about the nature of ascension. And we've moved to this location so that we actually are here at sunset, after sunset. It's going towards dusk, and we've got the pyramids behind us, and it's a perfect setting, actually, to have this kind of a discussion. What I'd love to do at this point is go back to Amarna.
Oh.
And I have to say that I was very struck by our trip to Amarna. And I want to thank you very much for taking us there, for having the courage to do so. And it took a lot of courage, I have to say, because the site itself has, in my view, actually been bombed out of existence, except for the top level tombs. And I could see, I have a tendency to sort of bilocate at times, and I could see what had been there in that valley, which was lush and amazing. And going into Nefertiti's palace, her portion of the palace, as well as the other palace, extraordinary feeling there. And I would love to hear how you kind of landed on Amarna and understood what was going on between Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and what we know the party line is one way, but I would love you to bring that, your version of what you understand of what really went on.
Okay. I feel very close to Amarna and to the royal family. Nefertiti Akhenaten, King Tut, was born and raised there. And Nefertiti Akhenaten had 6 daughters. And there was a situation in the 18th dynasty where Amenhotep III and Queen T, who were Akhenaten's parents, who were starting to get a little disgruntled with the power that the Almond priesthood had. And the Almond priesthood were, as I mentioned before, with Mott, they were able to sell little Shakti dolls to ensure people's passage to the other side by holding up the scale. If someone's heart was heavy, they'd say, "Don't worry, just pay us and we'll make sure you get across." And so Amenhotep III and Queen T were getting a little disgruntled, thinking, well, you know, that's not exactly spiritual. That is religious, but paying for your salvation isn't really getting yourself there. And so this was the conversation in the high court that would have been at Thebes, which is present-day Karnak. And Amenhotep III was very prolific in his building, and he had a lot of foreign relations. And so people from foreign lands, kings from foreign lands, would send their daughters to be in the high court of Amenhotep III, and so there was this real progressive kind of time frame, and the Amenhotep IV was Akhenaten's name prior to changing it. But once his parents had instilled this idea that it was time to get rid of the corruption, move beyond the corruption, and actually start over, they planted the seeds inside Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and Nefertiti was actually co-regent. So Akhenaten changed his name to get Amenhotep, Amen, the Amun priesthood, out of his name, and to change it to the Aten, which was the solar energy of the sun. And so over time there was a decision to reestablish the capital at Amarna. All right, so the Amun priesthood was corrupt, but there was also something else going on. The ancient Egyptians measured the movements of the planet Sirius, and there's evidence now that Sirius actually could be part of a binary star system with our sun. And actually there's a passageway in the Great Pyramid that always points to Sirius. And if you look at the extragalactic grid and run it again in Starry Night Pro, everything revolves around Sirius. So the Sothic cycle was actually 1260 years. And each time it went from one end to the other, the capital would change from Heliopolis, which is near the Cairo airport now, and Thebes, which is Karnak. And so this was one of those times. So Akhenaten and Nefertiti were alive during the time when this changing of the guard was supposed to happen. But because the Amun priesthood was so strong and so dominant in terms of getting half of everyone's grain to be given to the temple in order to ensure a proper burial, they were completely out of control and completely corrupt. And so as co-regent, Nefertiti, ruling with Akhenaten, and in the court of Amenhotep III and Queen T, who are the grand figures that you see at the entrance to the National Museum, they decided, what would happen if we started over? So they divided the distance between Heliopolis and Thebes exactly in half. They crossed the river to the other side of the Nile, and they decided they were going to start over. So plans were made, the architects were brought in, and a completely new society was started that was based on the acknowledgement of the sun, harmony with nature, beauty, creativity, and it was actually perfection. So there was flowers, everyone was happy, there was a real sense of discipline and honor and respect, and everyone was in a true state of spirituality. Well, before they moved there, they closed the temples of the Amun priesthood. And the Amun priesthood was right annoyed. They wanted their power back. They wanted people to be disempowered, to rely on them for their salvation. The Nilometer was at every temple, which was the measure of how high the Nile would flood, and there was notches. The more water came with the flooding of the Nile and the silt, the more fertile the fields would be, the higher the production of grain. So they always knew a few months before, at the flooding of the Nile, which corresponded in July to the heliacal rising of Sirius. And so Sirius appears to go beneath the horizon for 70 days, and then it would come back again, the Nile would flood, the season, the harvest would come after that, and it was known how much grain there would be. And the populace was to give half their grain to the temples, to the Amun priests, to ensure their salvation. Well, after the temples were closed, Nefertiti and Akhenaten had their populace with them. They said, you don't need to do that, just live here, honor the Aten. Amarna was then called Akhet-Aten, which is the horizon of the Aten, and the rays of the sun had little hands coming down to hold and nurture the populace, and so the whole system was different. Meanwhile, in the background, the Amun priesthood, who had remained in Thebes and in the rest of Egypt, were plotting, disgruntled, wanting things to go back the way they were. And so to this day, they say that Akhenaten was a heretic, he was crazy, he was deformed, he had a disease, and the Amun priesthood had the whole story on religion. They understood how the gods worked, but that's not really how it went. And so it's really curious to me, with my past life memories and having gone there many years ago and seen it run like a movie, very much like my experience at the Sphinx Temple. And my stomach would turn every time I would read all of these other stories. I mean, what do you mean he was crazy? It was beautiful. What do you mean? Spirituality is a much better idea than this silly religion where you pay somebody and the disempowerment of people instead of the empowerment of people. I thought they've got to be wrong. The ideas that were embraced by Nefertiti and Akhenaten made sense, and the energy and the creativity in the populace and the beauty there was unsurpassed. And the tragedy to me was we haven't had peace since.
Okay, but there was a plot, and what I want to do is sort of unravel that a bit, if possible, in terms of not only the killing of Tut, King Tut, but also his father, Akhenaten. So how did Akhenaten die, first of all?
Well, first of all, there's no way that I'm convinced at all. Having been at Zahi's press conference, I knew he was going to try to say that Akhenaten was Tut's father. And there's absolutely no way. And we've done the family tree, there's been psychic archaeology, there's people who remember. I knew that Zahi Hawass, head of the Department of Antiquities, was going to try to do that. I was at the press conference. They did not do the DNA testing with the mitochondrial DNA and the X chromosome. They used the Y chromosome, which is the boy chromosome, instead of the matrilineal line. And there is absolutely no way that it is a conclusive proof. But the other thing is Akhenaten, I think, would have shared a similar fate to Osiris. And the Amun priesthood was so angry, they did plot. They did infiltrate Amarna. And they slowly poisoned one of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters. And that led to the absolute, unconsolableness of Akhenaten. And so Tut most assuredly was raised in the high court. He was prepared to be of the Amun and the Aten. His name was Tutankhaten. And when there was a real shortage of boy babies right the way through the 18th dynasty. In the High Court of Hatshepsut, again, she became pharaoh. She was queen and she became pharaoh because there was a shortage of boys. So there was some kind of genetic anomaly happening. Most of the royal family, including Tut, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and some of the other sons and daughters, had distended skulls. They had Asian eyes. There was definitely a genetic anomaly going on. So, you know, was the father. I take issue with that. I don't think it's possible. Okay.
Yes, and absolutely, I would agree with that. But my understanding was that perhaps, this is where it gets very interesting also in terms of whether Tut was related by blood at all to Nefertiti and Akhenaten.
Well, I think for sure he was part of the High Court. I think that it's entirely possible that Queen T and Amenhotep III were his grandparents.
Okay.
Okay? But there's a missing link in there. And when they say that they're using the DNA from Akhenaten, we have no proof that they found Akhenaten. It's my conviction, just right down to the cellular level, they're never going to find Nefertiti and Akhenaten. When they say the mummy of Akhenaten, and they're showing on YouTube, on the National Geographic site, they're looking at a skeleton. In the 18th dynasty, all of them were mummified. Okay? And they say mummy, and you're looking at a skeleton, and they expect you not to notice. Okay? There's something wrong with that. Okay? Now, if you read as much as I've read and go through, you know, archaeology at the university level, at the PhD level, and look and look and look and look and look, there is no conclusive proof that they have Akhenaten. So how you can take the DNA and prove that it's Tut's father is not possible. And you cannot trace the lineage through the Y chromosome. Okay, the matrilineal line, the way it worked. The dynastic Egypt started in 3113 BC, which parallels the beginning of the Mayan calendar. All of Egypt was matriarchal prior to that. But the throwbacks from the matrilineal line were evidenced all the way through the dynasties, because the pharaoh, even in pharaonic times, had to marry the daughter of the pharaoh before him in order to keep the blue blood, the matrilineal line, going through. Mitochondrial DNA, which just really came into the scientific community not that long ago, is like tree rings, where if you take my father, me, and my son, and you, we would see instantly that the three of us are part of one family and you're part of another family. You could see instantly that my son is younger than me, I am younger than my father, and my father is the elder, because each of the transitions through the X chromosome of mitochondrial DNA, small mt, capital DNA, is about the leaving of the generational line. Okay? And so you would be able to tell if they're part of the same family. Now, there's a problem. Now, the other thing is, if you look at somebody like Ramses II, who was in the 22nd dynasty, his tomb had 67 rooms. King Tut's tomb is teeny tiny. And then next to it, there was a cache, C-A-C-H-E, of mummies found. And tomb robbers came and unwrapped the mummies and put them back in different boxes, and they really lost count of who was who and how it all worked. And then they seem to have taken all the furniture from Amarna and shoved it into this very small tomb and said, ta-da! But Tut was only ruling from the age of 8 to 18. And then they say they use the medical model to examine the tissue of the mummy of Tut. So they say he had a club foot, he had a cleft palate, he walked with a limp. Well, wait a minute, he was an enlightened being, he was perfect. They say, oh, and Hatshepsut was obese. So they're looking at the medical, oh, you have high blood, oh, we're going to give you medication. It's all the medical model. Well, that's not what was going on in the 18th dynasty. They were incredibly pure beings. And so, yes, Tut was raised in Amarna. Yes, he was part of the royal family. He was trained to walk both roads, so that at the fall of Amarna, he was taken on. But as soon as they found out that he was truly of the Aten, and he was only posing as being of the Amen, they knocked him off. It didn't take long. They got a hole in the skull. Oh, no, no. Lots of mummies have holes in their skulls. So this is, to me, a fabrication. I don't know what their agenda is. Well, I knew their agenda was to make the association, but they're not looking at it from a larger perspective. They're not including the matrilineal line, the matriarchal concepts that you need in order to understand what was truly going on throughout dynastic Egypt and all the way through pre-dynastic Egypt, which was most certainly matriarchal.
Okay, there are some lights. Can somebody hit the lights? In regard to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, how long did they rule?
18 years.
18 years. That's it?
That's it. That's a lot.
That's a lot?
Well, it's not as much as Ramses II, who ruled 65 years, but
okay.
18 years is a good run.
Okay, and what I was wondering is, how soon into their reign did they move to Amarna?
Well, it started out where Akhenaten was co-regent with his father, Amenhotep III. And so co-regent means ruling together. And so Amenhotep was a very strong pharaoh, and so he was passing the reins slowly until Akhenaten was able to take them. And as soon as he got the reins on his own, he joined with Nefertiti, and then he was co-regent with her. So I don't think there was a time when Akhenaten was ruling alone.
Okay, but during the reign, at what point did they move to Amarna?
They were building it. Well, they were building it and they were visiting it. Like, this plan was going on in the high court of Amenhotep III and Queen T all the way along. And so it took several years to build this the entirety of it. And so they would go back and forth and they would visit, and then they would be at Thebes. And then after a while, they ended up with the entire populace that was going to live there, and the whole thing had been transferred. Queen T would come and visit, like grandma coming to see the grandchildren and that sort of thing. And so it was very much transitional.
Okay. And when Tut was born, at what point into their reign do we know?
Well,
approximately age-wise.
I don't know how to say that. He was 8. He was 8 when he started ruling, and he lived till he ruled till he was 18, and so that was like 8, 9 years, 10 years in there.
Okay.
So
because I was wondering, my understanding was that at Karnak they were plotting. Obviously, you're saying they were poisoning Akhenaten. No, his daughter.
Slowly.
How did he die at that point, or do we know? Is that
no, she died. But then he became inconsolable.
Right.
And he knew that the Amun priesthood had infiltrated. And so it was the beginning of the end. And so it was the beginning of the end. Everything started to deteriorate, and they were plotting and really trying to take over. So once the Amun priesthood were running Horemheb, okay, so there was and that's who you see in King Tut's tomb. And I was the vizier. He was not royal. Okay, so Tut was the last of the royals. And then Smenkhare married the eldest daughter of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and he ruled for 9 months. But what was happening is the espionage was going along, and they were trying to take over the dynasty. And Horemheb was horrible Heb. He was like a miserable one that was attached to the Amun priesthood. They wanted to open all the temples again. They did. And then they ruled with an iron fist, and they came and they demolished Amarna. So Amarna is one of the only places where there aren't layers. And so even to this day, you see a Muslim mosque inside the Luxor temple. Layers and layers and layers. Temples underneath temples. Even here, there was a temple of Isis toward the left shaft of the Sphinx's paw. And it goes on like that. So Amarna, they just absolutely, you've seen it. They flattened it.
Yes.
And everything is gone. They broke up all the pieces of the building, and they put them together, and they called them teletats, little blocks that a single man could just pick up. They took them to Karnak, filled up the pylons, and it was only when there was an earthquake that they found any of it. And so they absolutely came in and took over. They reestablished the old ways, and they say they reestablished the gods, but that's also a misnomer, and they were trying to say that, you know, Nefertiti and Akhenaten had monotheism. They still had Isis and Mot, the principle of Mot, and the storyline of Osiris and Isis and Horus, and all of that. Nui, the cosmology, they didn't get rid of any of that, but they recognized the solar power and the whole idea of the regeneration and the importance of the sun. And the Amun priesthood was all about, we're running it, people know nothing, people are not empowered on their own, and they just reestablish things the way they were.
Okay, so at a certain point, though, something must have happened to Akhenaten, or because when they took Tut to Karnak, and he basically took the throne, didn't he take the throne at Karnak as opposed to Amarna?
Yes, and so I figure that they killed him, and that Nefertiti walked away. Very much like Mary Magdalene, just walked away, and she was never heard from again. She probably changed her identity, and we don't know for sure, but like when they say, you know, they think they found the mummy of Nefertiti, I say no. And they whoever they found that they thought was Nefertiti, Fleming, whatever her name was, that it was doing the red-haired lady, and they understood Queen T and all that. It was someone in the High Court. It was someone who knew Nefertiti. But they're not going to find Nefertiti and Akhenaten. That's just something that I feel a very strong conviction in my bones. And I think that Akhenaten probably met the fate of Osiris, that was cut up to pieces and thrown into the Nile. They don't have him, and I don't think they're going to find him.
Okay, and my intuitive take is that they were of ET lineage, and that each one actually represented a different group of ETs because their physicality was very different. Akhenaten and Nefertiti each. Well,
you stood there in the National Museum in the Amarna room, and there is a figure of Akhenaten and there's a figure of Nefertiti. Some people say they're both Akhenaten, but they do have a similar thing. They almost have two belly buttons. They've got the distended skull. They don't feel shy to show breasts on a man, sort of, you know, because the sacred feminine was honored. I don't know that they were that different. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But Hatshepsut herself said that her father was taken over by a star being when he impregnated her mother, and she was half star being. And so they weren't...
Where was she in the lineage, though? Was she after them?
No, no. She was at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, early in the 18th dynasty. Her father was Thutmose I. Thutmose II was her husband, Thutmose III was her brother, and it went on like that. And Thutmose IV is the one that went to the Sphinx, and the Sphinx was buried up to here, and he heard a voice and said that the Sphinx said to him that he would be Pharaoh if he unburied the Sphinx, and he had made the stela that has the mirror image of the Sphinx on either side, which is almost like a portal to go through, like the stereograms that use both sides of the brain. That was all part of Hatshepsut's lineage. Now, if you go on internet and do 18th dynasty family tree and find 12 websites, you're going to find 12 family trees. It's my conviction that Hatshepsut was the great-great-great-grandmother of Akhenaten, and that she came straight through the lineage, okay, and that it was the same family, and that the starseeds were coming back. The idea is that they had, in the matriarchal aspects of ancient Egypt, they had these principles, and they were percolating up and being remembered, very much like people who were incarnate in Atlantis came back at the high times of ancient Egypt when we had the high-level technology and the high-level initiates, and we're back now. And I think it's us. Okay? And so I think that there was a similar thing in the 18th dynasty where Hatshepsut and the Amarna period came through, and it was the same sort of thing where the spirituality was percolating its way up in the face of the religion, and we have that now. We have that exactly now, where the fundamentalists, and we saw it, where they're shutting us down and they don't want us meditating. There we are at the Temple of Isis, putting our hands on the Holy of Holies, and somebody had the audacity to close their eyes, turn their palms up. No meditation. Not allowed. We toned. They're going to take the license of our tour guide and charge him 8,000 Egyptian pounds, which is what? $1,500. Something like that.
Yeah.
You know, because we prayed. When you see the invasiveness of the praying here, and so we went and sat inside the temple to Hathor. We closed our eyes, sat quietly, and turned our palms up, and we were told it was illegal.
That's right, that meditation was illegal when we were told to stop right away.
And how is peace and peacefulness hurting anyone?
Exactly.
How is sitting quietly grounds for anything illegal?
Absolutely, and the notion also of the temples themselves as places of reverence, of silence is what they are. It's clearly, it's clear when you walk into them that this is what was intended. And yet what is happening with the guards now is that they are actually moving against anyone showing any kind of reverence or any kind of peacefulness or meditative state.
Absolutely. And when you're in the Great Pyramid with the general public and people are just chit-chatting and clumping along, all of those idle thoughts get magnified. And I find it so incredibly disturbing. And in the temples, when it's crowded, people shoving and shouting and take a picture of me,
Yes.
And it's just ego.
Right.
And when the temple's clear, when the Great Pyramid is empty, instantly it resets. And the temples are constructed in a way that they replicate the cavities of the human body. And the Holy of Holies always enters through the feet. And the Holy of Holies is also always represented by the pineal gland. And the way it used to work is the general populace would enter the initial hypostyle halls, and you had to have higher levels of initiations to go through. And there was always a winged disc with a cobra, a uraeus, and the vulture, which is the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, that had to be in harmony. The lower self would surrender to the higher self, and you would walk into the temple with the highest good of humanity in mind. Drop your ego at the door. Well, now they don't even want us quiet. They encourage the idea of the mishmash and the ego, and it's ludicrous that being silent they would find. I don't know. I don't have words for it.
Absolutely. Well, it's an outrage, and I have to say that also they're trying to prevent people from taking pictures in certain areas, which is very interesting. They're also blocking off large portions, very suspect portions, in my opinion, of certain temples. And it seems intentional.
Oh, definitely.
It seems like there's a lockdown, and this whole idea of also closing the pyramids to allowing people to go in them, to go near them, even the Sphinx, the same thing. The notion that, because what happens with these pyramids is there's a force field. They exert. I mean, it definitely goes this far.
Definitely.
Even farther.
Sure.
And it's said to even be possibly a balancing sort of fulcrum for the planet in general. So we're talking about a huge force field. We're also talking about the notion that if we're right, and you can go into, say, the Great Pyramid or even the Second Pyramid, and your vibration is raised such that ascension becomes more of a possibility. If you can be triggered, if you can go through initiations that can then lead to spiritual development, further development. If they lock all those doors off from humanity, then we're really talking about a dumbing down of humanity in general, and a plot that's going on with respect to the Egyptian government. And they are, in essence, financed by the U.S. government for all intents and purposes. So what we have is something rolling out that sounds very much like the Illuminati and what's going on.
Yep. And I've been coming here since 1977, when there was no wall, when everything was different. I spent 5 years in and out of holes on the plateau, exploring the tunnels. And then they put the wall up. And so to me, it very much felt like locking the barn after the horse was already stolen. We already know that personal empowerment is within us. It's a bit late to shut it down.
Sure.
And it's obvious that they feel threatened by the idea of personal empowerment. And it's exactly parallel structure to the 18th dynasty. The Amun, we still say Amen when we're finished a prayer. And the Amen of the 5 phases of the cycles of time in Egypt is the dark of the dark. And Heper is the scarab, which is the dawn. And in 2012, we are turning the corner from this as well. And so they are very threatened by the idea of personal empowerment, that God is within us, God, Goddess, Father, Mother, God, inside men, inside women. We have deciphered the code. We already understand. Sorry, you're too late.
Okay, thank you, Carmen Balta. That was beautiful, I have to say. So I'm going to keep that part, just in case. Okay, yeah, absolutely. And what also seems to be going on, though, is that there are some signs and symbols within the pyramids, within the code of the pyramids, I should say, and the placement and the fact that there are signs on the faces of the various temples that all point to a transition between life and death that is not considered in current religion, and that the Egyptians understood more about death than is understood currently on the planet, in my opinion. And could you address that?
Well, first of all, in the ancient language, which was called Suf, and Sufism is related to that, and whirling dervishes are still here, and that's Sufi dancing, in a way. In the ancient Suf language that Hakim knew from the village of Abu Sir, which is just down the road, the indigenous wisdom keepers told him these stories and taught him the language that wasn't written down. There is no word for death. They call it westing. And so the sun goes down, as we just saw it go down, to the west. The Sphinx greets the sun every day to the east, and they called it westing, knowing that the sun would come up again. And so we transition. Now the populace was taught how to live well through the understanding that we almost certainly will show up again. Now, they talked about Ka, the Ka, which is the body double, and the Ba, which is the soul part that lives no matter what. And so the ancients were into abilities. They had abilities. Now, I'm not saying that the farmers in the field had it, but the high-level initiates understood that we had a body double, so when they were bilocating, it was the light body that would go and be in the other location. And they understood all kinds of things like teleportation and telepathy, and they were able to manifest and do alchemy. All of this was part of the transmutation of the atom, which was metaphorically occurring in the machine of magnetic power, passive, non-polluting power in the Great Pyramid. But also, we are 70 to 80% water, so the transmutation of the atom was occurring within the initiates. And so these abilities, they had the Ka, okay, that would bilocate, but the Ba was the part of the soul that lived on. So when Anubis met you and said you're dead, you go, I am, I feel the same. Well, the part of you that drops the body, that lived inside the clothing of the body, is still there. So the ancient Egyptians understood this, which is why they wanted to know how to navigate the bardos. And so it's said that there are 7 bardos, and it takes 7 days to navigate each one. And so it would take 49 days for the soul to kind of figure out what's going on, to pay the respects. And there was a judgment day, which is replicated in Catholicism, but it wasn't judgment of you, that I'm going to judge how you are and what you did. It was the judgment of the self and the fair witnesses. So when you see the shape of the knees up and all of them either holding the feather of Ma'at in a row, they were fair witnesses. They would sit and observe while you judged yourself. How do you think you did in the evolution of your own soul? That was what was important. And so when you go into the Valley of the Kings, which you're not allowed to speak in, then they put you into silence when you have to, when it could be that you could be instructive and explaining what was going on there. Then no guides, no one's allowed to talk in there. And so it's like again, it's just to cross-reference so that we don't understand what they knew.
You should also talk a little bit about the fact that you yourself are not supposed to be our guide, technically. That we have to have an Egyptian guide who is basically the one who's supposed to be speaking.
Yes, and they're trained and they memorize all of the stuff about Ramses and the 19th dynasty was Seti's, but you know, 21st and 22nd dynasty was Ramses, first, second, third, Ramses, who discovered that he quite looked like Amenhotep III in a race, you know, and so it's all the warring, and they cut off the hands of the enemy, and you see them holding them up by the hair, and then they have the sacred feminine, and they have the storylines of what was really going on, but it's almost like this adjunct, you know, and the rest of it you know, conquer and all of that, and it has nothing to do with the true spirituality. And so this is what the guides are trained to tell you. And so when I stood here and listened to a few guides, I just felt my stomach turning. I felt like I wanted to pass out. They'd say, you know, this is Ramsey, and I'd go, who said? You know, and I had this voice inside my head, and then I'd be arguing with myself like, what, who's talking, and why do you think you know anything here? But the fact of the matter is that they want the patriarchal story coming down that's replicating the idea of the Catholic Church, that power over, not power from within. And so if I'm giving an explanation in the National Museum, there are guards that stand there that will shut you down. They'll shut me down. They'll tell me, no, madame, not allowed, no speaking. So if you're chit-chattering and saying, take my picture, you're allowed. But if you're making sense of ancient Egyptology in a true way that's about self-empowerment, they will follow you and shut you down because they want the old story. And I looked into becoming a traditional guide, and you have to memorize the script. And it's all about Ramses. And and you can say New Kingdom, this and that, and Old Kingdom, but you're not really supposed to even know the story. It's insidious, yes, and it's brutal. And we still know that there's a truth that exists anyway, no matter what they do.
Okay, well, the truth is inscribed in the temples, if you look close enough. And certainly you're an expert at doing that. And I thank you for that. And I think that more people who can watch this video, watch the Pyramid Code, can start to get a clue that there is something going on, that there is a history that they don't know, that has been hidden from them with regard to Egypt. And the interesting thing is that as we get closer to 2012, even in the last 4.5 years since I've been here, there's a huge upsurge in tourism here. And one would think that there seems to be almost an innate signal going off that is sending people to Egypt at this time. Where they are, whether they know it or not, looking for their past. And that there may be keys to ascension here that they are hoping to find, to trip into. Unfortunately, the guards are not trained in this knowledge, but you are. Well, you're one of the few.
But the irony here is that people who have the hunch and all their lives they wanted to go to Egypt, and then they get here, stand there and go, oh, I thought it was and they get shoved the old story, and they get cross-wired. Right. And to me, this is similar to what they do on TV. And I've given the example before because I think it's so clear. The movie Stargate starts out, the first half hour is so engaging, and it appeals to the unconscious part in us that wants to believe, that already knows that this is true. And then they start with the blood and the gore and the fighting and the blood from death instead of blood from life. Menstrual blood, matriarchal, is blood from life, which is different than blood from death. And so you see the priests, and they've got the Virgin Mother red, white, and black colors, and then they use a sacrificial lamb instead of the highest form of DNA, which is matriarchal. So they cross-wire us with the truth of the first 30 minutes, and I call it the scriptwriter's fantasy. So this is what happens: is people feel inspired to come to Egypt, and then they stand there and listen to all this Ramses stuff and go, oh, it doesn't add up. So they came to Egypt with the hopes of being triggered. They're standing in the sacred structures that could trigger them if they were empty, and just they stood there. It would trigger their unconscious. They're looking at the frescoes, but they don't know what they're looking at because it's hidden in plain sight. You can look at these frescoes and go, what am I looking at? You don't know. And so what I've tried to do with people who come on the tours is give you little clues to decipher, and then to create sentences in your own head with the symbols so that you can piece it together. And I say, I'm not going to be there when you're looking at your pictures and when you're doing further reading. So if these few little pieces of the code can come together and make sense to you, then you can start to decipher for yourself. Because in actuality, as I said, if the Egyptians were concerned about biology, how we got here, they were well versed in quantum physics, they understood astronomy and the movement of the planets for sure, and they wanted to know what happened when we left. And it makes sense. They acknowledge the gods and goddesses. Now we channel. We're closer to the ascended masters. What's different? It's us. And I've also said, if there's such a thing as our future lives from the past of when we were in Atlantis and in Egypt and here, if we knew that things were going to be as absolutely dumbed down as they are now, and it was up to you, me, and our little audience to say, how are we going to trigger ourselves in the face of abuse and pollution and insanity and power over and a few people making money at the expense of everyone else? What would we leave for ourselves as clues? And that's what you see on the temple walls.
Very well said. Absolutely. Okay, is there any last things that you would like to put into this discussion that we're having? And, you know, really I could talk to you all night and all day, but under the circumstances, I don't want to impose on you too long. But what I would like to know is there any sort of bits and pieces that you can gather at this time to put into this discussion we've had that might have been overlooked?
Well, I think if there's one thing left to say, since I started coming in 1977, when I was in my 20s, I have seen such an incredible force to disengage people from being here. And there is systemic stress in people all over the world from hyperinflation, and the pollution is abominable. The traffic, 10 million people commuting in and out of Cairo every day, the conditions of not hardly even being able to breathe the air. When you think of the purity and the sanity and the peace and the creativity that we had in ancient Egypt, this is craziness. And for people to long to feel the sanity of the ancient times and the force field and the split between the cultures being widened instead of narrowed, and to have the conditions so difficult for people to be able to realize these truths, speaks to me of an incredible time of darkness when we're right poised on the brink of coming into light. That these are indeed difficult times and brilliant times, and it's really not that easy to uncover these secrets. And it seems that the powers that be are crippling us and sending, you know, thought viruses and building mind control towers and everything that you talk about in terms of a plot or a conspiracy. And I guess I rest on the note, it's not really working. We have endured difficult conditions, we've been tested, and we're still here talking.
Absolutely. And we did notice that in our travels that we were being sort of targeted, if you will, that there seemed to be an increased number of what appear to be towers that are capable of sending out scalar weapon signals to dumb down people here in Egypt. In other words, that there seems to be a grid being laid upon the grid.
Yes.
To redirect the energies in certain ways that we have no idea what they're doing, but there seems to be some concerted effort to change the directions of the ley lines even.
Well, and not only that, how many policemen got on the buses with us with their AK-47s, and how many guards and watchmen have to be there, you know, with their uniforms while we do a ritual that we then have to pay for? Because it used to be that Abu Ghraib, we'd go through, and you'll see it in the Pyramid Code, there's no booth, there's no gate, you go through this mango grove, and then they turn it into charging us thousands of dollars to go do the same thing, and we have to bring a whole busload full of policemen with us to protect us when there was nobody there in the first place. And so that these are indeed difficult times and brilliant times, and it's really not that easy to uncover these secrets. And it seems that the powers that be are crippling us and sending, you know, thought viruses and building mind control towers and everything that you talk about in terms of a plot or a conspiracy. And I guess I rest on the note, it's not really working. We have endured difficult conditions, we've been tested, and we're still here talking.
Absolutely. And we did notice that in our travels that we were being sort of targeted, if you will, that there seemed to be an increased number of what appear to be towers that are capable of sending out scalar weapon signals to dumb down people here in Egypt. In other words, that there seems to be a grid being laid upon the grid,
Yes.
to redirect the energies in certain ways that we have no idea what they're doing, but there seems to be some concerted effort to change the directions of the ley lines even.
Well, and not only that, how many policemen got on the buses with us with their AK-47s, and how many guards and watchmen have to be there, you know, with their uniforms while we do a ritual that we then have to pay for, because it used to be that Abu Ghraib, we'd go through, and you'll see it in the Pyramid Code, there's no booth, there's no gate, you go through this mango grove, and then they turn it into charging us thousands of dollars to go do the same thing, and we have to bring a whole busload full of policemen with us to protect us when there was nobody there in the first place. And so when they're standing there, they're increasing the difficulty of us doing true spiritual work. They're making us pay to pray. And it seems like such overkill, pun intended. Like, it's just bad. And to me, it kind of breaks me down. Like, I kind of feel like it's really unpleasant. And there's a part of me that says, forget it, I don't want to do this anymore. But the thing is so many people want the truth and want to come to Egypt with me, and I've managed over 14 years of leading tours to pretty much protect people and have them see really wonderful places, and I feel like, you know, I'm getting tripped, you know, and getting my, you know, tripped and tied, making it impossible, you know. And the level of spiritual people who managed to come did feel perhaps a little tired by the difficulties we had, but they are very resilient and they bounce through, they see straight through to the truth, and we survived, thankfully. But everybody was challenged, and it shouldn't be so difficult.
Absolutely. One last question in regard to the incredible amount of garbage on the streets of Cairo and in the riverbeds and the canals and so on. And I've actually taken pictures. And I'm wondering, because, you know, there's no reason why, with the riches that are thrown into the coffers from the United States and elsewhere, that garbage couldn't be collected here. And yet the people have to live in this kind of filth. And again, we've got beautiful temples and beautiful, you know, monuments such as the pyramids, and yet if you look, you know, you take the time to walk down a city street, it's absolutely appalling. And again, that seems to be an added part of the plot.
Well, and I have cleaned the inner chamber of the heart of the Sphinx, full of garbage, plastic bags. It took me 3.5 hours. I cleaned the subterranean chamber in the pit. I was in there by myself, and I was thinking I was going in there to meditate, and I ended up becoming the garbage picker, you know. And, you know, it's highly illegal to take anything off the plateau, even garbage. And then you go to places like Luxor or Al Kharga, and the streets are clean. So yes, it's a measure of consciousness, but there's 30 million people in Cairo. And so another metaphor is, if you take the entire population of Canada now and push it into the space of the city of Calgary, which is the largest square mileage of any city in North America, and you take out the traffic lights except one, and take out the garbage removal system or divide it in half, you have Cairo with 10 million people driving in and out every day. That is insanity. And they could clean it up. They could give people a sense of pride, but it's very harsh conditions here, and
right. But the people, you know, do have a sense of pride, and Egyptians do, and they actually do love, you know, the Sphinx and the pyramids and their temples, and this is part of their heritage as well. So what we would ask is that there be an effort put into that direction. And there's no reason why it couldn't happen.
Well, and I didn't mean sense of pride with the monuments. I meant a sense of pride with the street. And so you see somebody opening a pack of cigarettes and throwing it out the window, and they think they're creating employment for the guy coming along with the brush and the broom, but you just can't keep up. You just can't keep up.
Yeah, it's incredibly tragedy. Okay, Just in terms of 2012 and where we're going, there is definitely a movement toward the light. And as you've demonstrated here, that seems to be part of the progression and part of the story that is indeed being traced through Egypt at this time, and through the story of the line of where we end up in the progression of the equinox. Can you talk at all about 2012 and beyond, and where you think that Egypt might go from there?
Well, that's a difficult question in terms of modern Egypt. Ancient Egypt is one story. Modern Egypt could continue to get more populated, more dense with pollution. And in terms of the precession of the equinoxes, actually, if it is spring equinox, it won't be till March 2013, till spring equinox, where the new cycle is actually in place. And so I'm not sure how to answer that in terms of Egypt will likely continue to become more populous in terms of visitors. And hopefully we will be learning lessons from the frescoes, and more people will realize what ancient Egypt's really about. Now, again, a movement is afoot where the secrets are out and people have access to this sort of thing. The Pyramid Code is 5 whole hours with this described in detail, and hopefully it'll catch on and people will understand sitting in their homes or sitting here.
Okay, and I certainly do agree with you and hope that that's the case, and certainly this will work in that direction. So I guess we will call it a day at the moment. It's night here on the plateau, and it's been a pleasure, Carmen Valde. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carrie.
Sonar TV. We live on pure electricity, caught in the strings of love's design. We supercharge our mind.
What?
Yeah.
Morning everybody, Martin.
Spiral suddenly, eagle feathers, love and me. Inside our sonar teepee, we live on pure electricity, caught in the strings of love's design.
So because we're to the south, the Great Pyramid's actually the farthest. So you'll see that the Great Pyramid and the Third Pyramid look the same size, with the Second Pyramid looking really dominant. Yeah? But from Mena House in various places, so you always look at the capstone is still on the Second Pyramid on all four sides. And so you look at the relationship, and the Great Pyramid's always flat on the top, and that tripod up there was from the Second World War, where they put three flags up there. And it did used to have a capstone in the very, very ancient times, like I say 50,000 years ago. But then the power of that was getting such that it had to go into the affairs. And then it was inaccessible in the affairs. So at Millennium Shift, they were going to put up, and they said they were going to, and on December 30th, they said, what's security? We changed our mind, which is their secret. But anyway, the point of the matter is that the way the pyramids are shaped, any picture of the pyramid, depending on the relationship to each other and the size, can give you an exact location of where the picture was taken. And so I like to play that game. Whenever you see pictures of the pyramid, okay, you had to be to the north, you had to be to the south, you have to be far away. So coming down at the road to Alexandria, from 25 miles away, the light reflects off the pyramids, and you can see it that far away because of the way the sun is shining on it. So in some way, the pyramids are a real navigation device. They are a thing for the solar system, but they're also something for the galaxy, because these three pyramids make the belt of Orion. Okay, so the celestial Nile is where the river used to flow. And if you look in Starry Night Pro, Sirius is always behind Orion. Orion's pointing his sword at the Pleiades. So if you look at Abu Sir, there's 7 pyramids there, and the whole thing runs in a line with the Milky Way. Now if you take any other planetary system and run it 50,000 years forward and 50,000 years back, the planets just split up. But if you take this configuration with the Nile, 50,000 years forward, it never splits up. So in Thomas Brophy's book, he says that in 8,000 something something, he picks a date and he said that these planets aligned. And then he took 2 dates, but there was no context for cultural context for why those dates were true. So I thought, okay, they align, that's good. But I started running it, and I realized they always align. So he kind of threw a dart at the map and said they align, without realizing that that's the X marks the spot, which is why the ancients put this here as markers. So even before the pyramids were built, it's my conviction that the ground plan is unified, and they already knew that. So there could have been other buildings. So when we drive around the second pyramid, you'll see that there's a rectangular shape to the platform, and the base of the pyramid's square. So it stands to reason that there would have been another building there. And we know for certain that the pyramids were built in stages, and they were renovated. So when they say that the pyramids were built in 2450 BC, that's the last renovation, okay? And there is evidence of building. But you'll see that they started putting granite around, and they did all kinds of things. But if you think over a 50,000 year period of time, of course there's going to be different things, different functions, different uses, different looks and feels. And that's what we need to look at, how old something is, what the construction of the stone is. And so as we move through the temples, we're going to see different styles of hieroglyphic, different styles of construction, and that's what I want you to think about. The first thing, old, which is the lowest, medium, or young. And then to start to piece it together in terms of the time frame. Okay, so that's just a little grounding for what we're going to do.
What did they do to the walls?
What do you mean?
They cleaned off the walls.
Well, when they destroyed Amarna, they took everything. So they ruined the walls. They took all the artifacts. They destroyed.
Why did they do that?
Well, they were very angry at Akhenaten and Nefertiti for wanting to subscribe to the empowerment of the human. They wanted to have the Amun priesthood was very angry because they wanted to have all the power, and they wanted people to pay for their salvation. North Palace is all the way over there. Yazri said 6 kilometers, but I thought it was more like 3, which is similar to between Karnak and Luxor. right? Because you can see how the walls contain the entirety of the city, and it would have had many buildings. And between 10 and 25,000 people would have lived here at the time. And this was the first structure they put here before they started moving people. And then Abusir and Saqqara and Dashur, and all of those are a sky-ground correlation that parallel the Nile where it used to run, and so you can see the old riverbed, but now the Nile is 8 miles to the east. But it's significant that that configuration follows the configuration of the stars and the planets in the sky. And so how the ancients could have understood this is beyond most people's capacity to understand. So if you think that Sirius would have been Abu Rosh, and you can go into Starry Night Pro and put in the planets Sirius, Orion, and the Pleiades, and what you'll see is that the belt of Orion, the sword of Orion is pointing to the Pleiades, and Sirius is behind, always, and you'll see on the ceiling of the Temple of Dendera that Isis always has her hand around the belt of Orion. She stands behind him on the solar boat, and Orion's sword points to the Pleiades. Now what's significant here, they say Sirius is the dog star in the Dogon tradition, and a dog generally on the leash follows behind. Yeah, and the sword pointing to the Pleiades. But the most significant thing is that the alignment never separates. So in Starry Night, you can roll things back 50,000 years and you can roll things forward. It's solstice, and the very next day there's 1 more minute of light, 2 more minutes of light, and 3 days later we're starting to feel pretty good, even though we have the same amount of light as we did 6 days ago when we were 3 days before solstice. But the emergence of light starts to make us feel better, and this is where we're heading in humanity, humanity is heading now as we approach 2012. And so if you think of the top of a cup of water, we have been approaching this galactic alignment since 2008. If you think astrologically, a conjunction is within 6 degrees. 2008 we hit the edge, solstice. 2009 10, 11, 12. And so what's been happening is we've been approaching the energy and spinning out of it, and approaching the energy and spinning out of it. But every time we approach, we're getting closer to the bullseye. But I think that's why we've had the tsunamis and earth here, all the way to Dashur, 15 miles to the south, are an encodement of a sky-ground correlation that's much more extensive than Robert Bauval indicates when he says that the three pyramids of Giza are associated with the belt of Orion. That seems to be true, and there seems to be a lot more to it than that. But also, in terms of the Hall of Records, a lot of people think that you're going to find an English book underneath the left paw of the Sphinx, and that it's going to reveal the secrets. But I think that the encoding has to do with an understanding of the ancient knowledge of initiations and the high-level initiates and the knowledge that they had. And so that's also a code.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. It could even be encoded in a sort of hologram, isn't that right?
Yes, a hologram, but also hidden in plain sight. So there's many frescoes that are indicating things, and some people think it's stylized. And when you see two left hands, and that the Egyptians didn't really know, how to do the hands properly, without realizing that that in itself is also a symbol that has a source to it that's very deep for the Egyptians. So there's a few symbols that have been overlooked, and that haven't been deciphered, that really are keys to a whole world of ancient Egypt.
So can you talk about some of that? And I'm also curious, just to backtrack a tiny bit, which is where you're talking about the peace, a peace configuration. Why do you say peace in terms of the placement of the 6 sites?
Band of Peace. At Abu Ghraib, Hakim is an indigenous wisdom keeper, and he is featured in the Pyramid Code, and he left us 2 years ago, August. And he talks about how it was peace and food, that the peace along the plateau and the pyramid sites, the 6 sites, actually the peacefulness of the way the high-level initiates existed here and the work they did was actually food for the people. Peace was food. So the Band of Peace is indicating that, that it wasn't what we have now. Patriarchal ways of being and thinking that are warring, and one person fighting against the other, and competitive and that sort of thing. The ancient Egyptians in pre-dynastic Egypt actually were matriarchal, and so there's a lot more to it than traditional Egyptology has been telling us.
Right, and that's something that you
jaguar outside my door, stretched out and purring, waiting for more. Strange shade of stone, deep cat-eye green, no way to escape, no one hears my scream. He's come here so often, just when I'm alone, I can't help the longing I'll feel when he moans. He's a jag, he's a jag, he's a jaguar. He's a jag, he's a jag, he's a jaguar. He's a jag, he's a jag, he's a jaguar. He's a jag, he's a jag, he's a jaguar. There is a jaguar outside my door, stretched out and purring, waiting for more. Strange shade of stone, deep cat-eye green, no way to escape, no one hears my scream. He's a jag, he's a jag, he's a jaguar. He's a jag, he's a jag, he's a jaguar.
Hi, I'm Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and I'm here with Carmen Balta. And we are in Cairo, Egypt, at the base, practically, of all three pyramids and the Sphinx, and this is the plateau. What do you call this? The Sphinx Guest House. That's the location, right?
Yep.
And I'm very happy to be here. We've just been on a marvelous trip all through Egypt, and Carmen has been leading us and informing us as to some of the true history of Egypt. And so I'm here to ask her a few questions and to really reveal some of the things you told us on the trip as much as possible for the Camelot audience. So Carmen has recently made a video called The Pyramid Code. You were filmed as well as, I imagine, you produced and directed it.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yep. It's five TV episodes, 5 hours, and it's been shown in 24 countries, and now it's out on DVD.
Okay, wonderful. And we encourage anyone watching this to go out and get the Pyramid Code from her website. It will be linked from this page as well. So, Carmen, what I'd like to ask you, first of all, is why you called it the Pyramid Code.
Well, I think that there's so much information about the pyramids, and a lot of it is encoded, and there's secrets that still haven't been uncovered, and a lot of misinformation about the pyramids. And so I think that there's a way of looking at it so that we can reveal some of the lost secrets.
Okay, but in terms of code, is that just a generalization for the secrets, or is there a specific code that you've uncovered?
Well, I think that the Band of Peace, which is the expanse of 6 pyramid sites from Abu Rosh to the north of quakes and all the earth changes, is because we really are in this now. And so when people say that when we approach 2012 Armageddon's going to hit, they're actually using images from tsunamis that have already happened, from earthquakes that have already happened. And so I think this doomsday, and it's all going to hit us at solstice 2012 is actually a little bit of an exaggeration. It could be that we actually finish or are close to finishing with it then. And the other thing that's significant is the whole alignment is sunset Giza, and we're watching the sunset as we sit here, 2012. And so December 21st, 2012. So some people have said it's 11:11 in the morning and it's configured at Greenwich Mean Time. No. If you look in Starry Night Pro, it's sunset, the Great Pyramid, December 21st, 2012.
Okay, well, that's fascinating. Are you planning to be here then?
Yes, and we were here for 10-10-10 in the Great Pyramid, which is considered an ascension portal. 11-11-11 is another one, so November 11th, and then 12-12-12. And if a group is here, we would be in the Great Pyramid for December 12th, but at sunset on the 21st, I would hope to join with other groups and be on the plateau at sunset to feel the exact precision of that galactic alignment.
Okay,
So move
well,
it.
that's an interesting date to plan to be here. So let's hope that the world situation will hold steady to allow for that.
Yes, well, we do need to hold it steady. So moving on with the other goddesses, Hathor would be another goddess, and she is the only human personification that you see on any of the temple pillars in Egypt. What you see is capitals, the tops of pillars, that are either papyrus or lotus, and they represent the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, and you'll see that at the Holy of Holies at Karnak, one of each, indicating that the balance between the masculine and the feminine has to be reached before the initiate could go into the Holy of Holies. And so Hathor has her own face, but what you see, and many people are curious about why you see Egyptian frescoes in two dimensions. You always see the profile of people, but with Hathor you see her face full. And the metaphor is that the profile of the two-dimensional being is actually in the third dimension, and Hathor being shown in three dimensions is actually a fourth dimensional and beyond being. So Tom Kenyon talks about the Hathors as a race of beings, and Hathor would be one manifestation of the great mother goddess who represents love and beauty and dance and all things that are joyful, and music and that sort of thing. So she is the great cosmic mother. Yes, and so she's highly significant, totally beautiful, has her own temple at Dendera, and then there is a shrine to Hathor at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae. And so Isis is the last of the four goddesses, and she represents the Sirius, the planet Sirius, as Osiris represents the configuration of Orion. And so whether these archetypal energies necessarily were incarnate or symbolic, how gods and goddesses were represented, it doesn't necessarily matter to the human psyche whether they're incarnate or not. It is the energy of the archetype that actually speaks to us. And it exists, the definition of an archetype is that it exists and it has power whether we're conscious of it or not. And so Isis is another manifestation of the Great Mother, and she is the mother of Horus, and every pharaoh emulated being a Horus. And so Isis, the story is that Osiris was confronted by his evil brother Set, and he chopped his body up into 14 pieces and scattered it, which is right out the window. And my first thought was, how close can you get to it? And then I startled again and thought, well, why do I care? Like, why is that interesting? So I was still very young, and I went to my mother and I said, where's Egypt? And she said, I don't know. look it up in the atlas. So I looked it up and I went, oh, it's on the African continent. And, you know, how do you get there? She says, I don't know, phone the airlines. And so at the age of 12, I found out that tickets were $1,400 at that age, and even in that day and age, and I was making 25 cents an hour babysitting, and I pledged that I would come to Egypt. So I came for the first time in 1977, and there's been a lot of changes since then, and I read everything I could get my hands on, and yet there was something that went on when I read that turned my stomach, that made me think that there was something wrong with the story. And so I came back in '94, and so there was a big gap in between from '77 to '94, and during that time I did an awful lot of research. But since then, I've come back 24 times.
Incredible, 24 times. And you've been interviewed on Coast to Coast, and you, I assume you've written some books?
Yes.
That I haven't read, I'm sorry, because I actually just learned about you when I interviewed you sort of off the cuff for Pig Radio is what it's called.
Yeah.
I was invited to be a co-host just for your interview, which was, you know, very unusual, sort of a serendipity, because it's what got me on this trip.
Yeah, with Jeremiah Duncan.
Yes.
Yeah. My book is called Angels and Archetypes, an evolutionary map of feminine consciousness. And in that book there's 22 goddesses, and their higher selves are angels, and it's a map that mirrors astrology, numerology, and tarot, and it's the lost secrets of the sacred feminine. And 4 of the goddesses are Egyptian goddesses, and 7 of them are Greek goddesses, and the rest of them are from around the world.
Fascinating. What are the 4?
The goddesses are Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty, Isis, Nui, some people call her Nut, but I don't think that's fair, and so she's the cosmic goddess, and Ma'at, who carries the feather of truth. And there's a story behind each one of them, for sure. Deep stories behind each one of them.
Okay, and it would be worthwhile for you to say something about each one if you are interested in doing so.
Sure. Mott, she has the feather of truth in her headdress, and it was a very instructive story to the general populace, because the idea is that when you died, you were met by the jackal-headed god Anubis, who says, "You're dead." And you go, "I am? I feel exactly the same." And they say, "Check it out, your body's down there." And then they say, "Let's have your heart." And they would take your heart and weigh it on the scales against the feather of truth. So if you had done something immoral, stolen, or done something that was against humanity in some way, your heart would be heavy. And the gods that met you would say, "We don't want you over here. You can't cross into the bardos unless you are light of heart." And so that was a way that the populace could live well and learn to live well. But later, in the later dynasties, when the Amun priesthood took over, you could buy your salvation, and you could buy these little Shakti dolls, and then Horus would hold up the scale and say, "Yep, you're good to go." And so that was a real distortion from the true spirituality that went to religion. And then if we go on to Nui, the milk from her breasts is the milk of the Milky Way. And so there's a sky-ground correlation between all of the pyramids, as I mentioned, from Abu Rosh through Giza.